No one believed in the farmer's broken horse until she defeated the millionaire's pride before an entire town. They said Ruby was worthless, a ghost of what she once was, but when the man with money and arrogance came to claim her home, the valley witnessed something no wealth could buy. A silent defiance, a heartbeat between man and horse that would humble even the proudest soul. The dawn broke slowly over the Montana plains, spreading a thin gold over the frost-bitten earth. The air still carried the sharpness of winter, yet somewhere beneath the soil, spring was beginning to breathe. Eli Turner walked the narrow path that cut through his field, the rope in his hand tracing the rhythm of his tired steps. Behind him followed Ruby, his chestnut mare, her gait uneven, her left leg scarred from a wound that had never quite healed. A drone hummed above them, gliding like a cold metal hawk. Its lens blinked red, recording the land, the horse, the man, measuring what could be sold. Eli stopped for a moment and looked up, one hand shading his eyes. The sky was too wide to fight against, yet his jaw tightened. He knew the man behind the drone. Mason Grant, the real estate magnate from Denver, was already counting the acres, planning his eco-park Cold River. Ruby stamped lightly, her breath forming clouds in the chilly air. The smell of damp earth mixed with her warm scent, the only familiar thing left in Eli's life. Once, years ago, he had built this ranch with his wife, Lydia, when laughter still filled the barn, and their dreams seemed endless as the horizon. But Lydia was gone now, and the laughter had faded with her. All that remained was the land, and the mare that everyone said was useless. "Easy, girl," Eli murmured, his voice low, worn by wind and loss. He brushed his fingers down Ruby's neck, feeling the coarse mane beneath his palm. "They only see a broken horse, but I see what's left of us." From the distance came the sound of an engine. Eli turned. 3 men in neon vests stood near a black truck, their laughter carrying across the open field. "Look at that thing," one said, pointing at Ruby. "You sure that's not glue material already?" The others chuckled. Eli's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't answer. He simply led Ruby forward, boots sinking into the thawing mud. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of pine and rain. Overhead, the drone buzzed lower, its whirring echoing like a taunt. Ruby's ears flicked back, her muscles tensed. Eli steadied her with a touch, whispering, "Don't mind them, girl. The land remembers who belongs to it." The truck doors slammed shut. The men left, leaving behind only tire marks across the wet ground. Eli watched the tracks disappear into the horizon. He felt an ache rise in his chest. Not just anger, but the old, familiar fear of being erased. He turned back toward the barn, the wooden beams leaning like old bones against the morning sky. Inside, dust floated through shafts of light, settling on tools that hadn't been used in months. Eli loosened Ruby's harness, the leather creaking. The mare lowered her head, her breath warm against his sleeve. "You and me, Ruby," he whispered. "Looks like the world's done forgetting what we were." Outside, thunder rolled far away, a soft warning of rain to come. He glanced toward the hill beyond the fence, where the drone had disappeared, and saw a dark SUV parked at the ridge. Even from that distance, he could make out the silhouette of Mason Grant standing beside it, sunglasses glinting in the pale light. Grant didn't wave. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Time was running out. Eli turned away, pressing his palm against Ruby's neck again. The warmth there was steady, alive. It grounded him. "We'll hold on," he said quietly, as if to the earth itself. "We've been through worse." Ruby nickered softly, a low, throaty sound that echoed through the empty barn. Eli allowed himself a small smile. For a brief moment, the heaviness lifted, replaced by the old rhythm of care and habit, feeding, brushing, patching the leaks in the roof. But as he moved, he could feel it. The ground itself seemed uneasy, the wind carrying whispers of something changing. The world around him was shifting toward progress and profit, leaving behind men like him. Men who built with hands, not machines. That night, long after the last light faded, Eli stood on his porch. The moon hung low and heavy, reflecting off the wet soil. Ruby stood near the fence, still, her breath rising in pale plumes. Across the field, the red light of the drone blinked once more before vanishing into the dark. Eli watched until it disappeared, then muttered under his breath, "Let him come. The land doesn't bow to money." Behind him, Ruby's hoof struck the earth once, as if in quiet agreement. The echo traveled through the ground, up his bones, and into the silence of the Montana night. And in that silence, soft, steady, and alive, the story began to stir. The next morning broke with a thin veil of mist hanging over the valley. The world looked soft, washed clean, but Eli Turner's mind felt anything but calm. The sound of the old windmill creaking in the distance was the only thing that filled the silence as he checked the water trough near the barn. Ruby stood quietly nearby, head lowered, her breath leaving faint clouds that vanished into the cold. The scar on her left foreleg glimmered faintly under the weak sunlight, a pale reminder of something neither of them wanted to remember. A voice broke the stillness. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Eli Turner?" Eli turned sharply. A young woman stood by the fence, her jeans spattered with mud, a large leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hair was tied loosely, strands of it catching the light like threads of copper. She smiled. But it wasn't the shallow smile of someone selling something. It was the kind that carried genuine curiosity. "I'm Maggie Lee," she said, offering a hand that Eli didn't take. "From Texas State. I'm doing research on mustangs and rural horse rehabilitation. I heard you've got one of the last purebred chestnut mares in this county." Eli frowned slightly, wary. "You heard wrong," he muttered. "She's no mustang, just a farm horse that got lucky enough not to be glue." But Maggie wasn't discouraged. She glanced toward Ruby, who had raised her head now, ears twitching in quiet alert. "She's beautiful," Maggie said softly. "There's something in her eyes. She doesn't look broken to me. Just guarded." Eli busied himself with the water pump, avoiding her gaze. "Guarded doesn't plow fields or pull carts," he said flatly. "Around here, a horse has to work to earn its feed." Maggie rested her arms on the fence, watching Ruby with the stillness of someone who understood patience. The mare sniffed the air, one cautious step closer. Eli noticed it, though he pretended not to care. "May I?" Maggie asked, gesturing toward Ruby. Eli hesitated, the instinct to protect his horse flaring before reason caught up. "She's skittish," he warned. "That's okay," Maggie replied, her voice calm, like a whisper that didn't disturb the wind. She moved slowly, every step deliberate, boots sinking gently into the mud. Ruby tensed, but Maggie stopped just out of reach. She didn't push closer. She just waited, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Eli's fingers tightened on the rope. He had seen dozens of people try to handle Ruby since the accident. Trainers, buyers, even a vet once. But they all shared the same flaw: impatience. They wanted to control, not listen. Maggie did neither. After a long minute, Ruby took one small step forward. The tip of her nose brushed against Maggie's outstretched hand. The girl didn't flinch, didn't even smile. She only breathed, slow and steady. "See that?" Maggie said gently, still facing the horse. "She remembers, but she's willing to trust again." Eli said nothing, but something flickered behind his eyes. The world seemed to hold its breath for that brief moment, the kind of silence you didn't want to break. Maggie finally stepped back, respecting the horse's boundary. She knelt briefly and examined the old wound on Ruby's leg, her fingers tracing the faint line where the skin had grown uneven. "She must have been caught in something deep," she murmured. "Mud, maybe wire. Took a while to heal?" Eli nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. 3 winters ago. Flood came out of nowhere. Barn roof caved in. She was stuck in the mire till morning." His hand brushed over the scar absent-mindedly. "Never ran right after that." Maggie looked up at him, eyes soft. "And yet, she's still standing." The simplicity of her words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to deflect with some dry remark, but all he could manage was a quiet, "Yeah, I guess she is." A flock of geese passed overhead, their cries fading toward the mountains. The wind picked up, fluttering the hem of Maggie's jacket. She straightened, brushing dirt from her knees. "Mr. Turner, if it's all right, I'd like to study her for a few days. Not for the university, just to understand her. I think she can teach me something." Eli gave a small grunt. "You can watch all you want, but don't expect her to do tricks. She's done being taught anything." Maggie smiled faintly. "Maybe it's not about teaching. Maybe it's about remembering." Eli didn't respond, but her words lingered long after she left the pasture. The quiet returned, though it felt somehow different, less hollow. He leaned against the fence, watching Ruby graze. She looked calmer, her movements less defensive, as if the presence of the stranger had softened something invisible between them. As the sun climbed higher, Eli walked back toward the barn. He paused in the doorway, glancing once more toward the hills where the SUV had stood the day before. It was gone now, leaving only the rustle of grass. He exhaled, long and slow. Inside, he poured himself coffee from the dented thermos on the workbench. The smell filled the air. Burnt, bitter, familiar. His eyes drifted to the old photo tacked above the table. Lydia, smiling beside Ruby when she was still young and strong. He traced the edge of the picture with a calloused finger. "She's not useless," he muttered under his breath, almost as if confessing. Outside, Ruby lifted her head at the sound of his voice, ears pricking. She gave a low, throaty whinny, soft but steady. It wasn't loud enough for the world to hear, but it reached Eli, and that was enough. The day stretched on quietly. Maggie's footprints by the fence began to fade under the afternoon wind, but the impression she'd left behind didn't. For the first time in months, Eli felt something shift inside him. Something small, fragile, and alive. By nightfall, he stepped outside again, leaning on the porch railing as the sky deepened to violet. Ruby was lying in her stall, calm, her breath slow. A faint smile crossed Eli's lips. Maybe the girl was right. Maybe some scars weren't meant to disappear. And somewhere, far across the fields, thunder rumbled faintly once more, just enough to remind him that peace, like trust, was never permanent. But for tonight, it was enough. That night, the wind carried a chill that slid beneath the doors and whispered through every crack of the old barn. The boards creaked like the tired lungs of an aging beast, and Eli Turner stirred from sleep to the faint sound of hooves scraping wood. He pulled on his coat, the cold biting into his knuckles as he reached for the lantern. The barn smelled of hay, rain, and something old, like forgotten memories, soaked into the timber. Ruby stood in her stall, restless, ears flicking back and forth, nostrils flaring. Her eyes glimmered dark under the lantern light. The shadows danced across the walls, as if replaying something neither of them wished to see again. "Easy, girl," Eli murmured, stepping closer. The mare stamped once, the sound sharp as a heartbeat. Her body trembled, muscles tightening, her breath quick and shallow. A loose window above them rattled against the wind, and Ruby jerked, pulling at the rope tied around her post. Eli froze. He'd seen that look before. Pure panic, the kind that came from a memory no one could erase. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Ain't no flood tonight." But Ruby didn't hear him. The smell of damp earth, the sound of wind beating the siding, it was enough to drag her back to that night 3 winters ago, when the river burst its banks and the barn roof gave way. Eli could almost feel it, too, the mud rising to his knees, the roar of water, her scream when the beam pinned her leg. He'd fought the flood till dawn, hands bleeding, lungs burning, praying she'd breathe. Now the ghost of that night had returned, and both man and horse felt it claw its way up from the floorboards. Eli reached for her rope, his voice steady, though his heart was thundering. "Hey now, Ruby, look at me." His palm brushed her neck, damp with sweat. The mare flinched, eyes wide and glassy, but she didn't pull away this time. "See?" he whispered. "It's just the wind." The storm outside grew louder. Somewhere in the distance, a gate slammed. Ruby snorted, her body arching again, and for an instant, Eli saw the reflection of his own fear in her eyes. He wasn't just trying to calm her, he was trying to calm himself. He stood there for what felt like hours, hand resting on her shoulder until her breathing slowed. Until his did too. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was fragile, like glass about to crack. When she finally settled, Eli leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the stall, his breath fogging the lantern light. "We made it through worse," he murmured. "Ain't that right?" Ruby gave a small snort as if in answer. Her ears flicked toward his voice, the tension in her spine easing. The faint sound of rain began to patter on the tin roof, soft and steady, the storm fading into something gentler. Eli stayed there, even after she'd fallen still, the smell of hay mixed with the faint sweetness of her breath. In that quiet, he could almost hear Lydia's voice again. "She trusts you more than anyone, Eli. Don't break it." He swallowed hard, pushing the memory away. The lantern sputtered, its flame dimming to an amber glow. He looked around the barn, old tools hanging in rows, ropes coiled like sleeping snakes, the air thick with dust, and the sound of Ruby's breathing. Every inch of this place held a story. Every creak was a reminder of something he couldn't change. He blew out the lantern and stood in the dark for a long while, listening. The night had settled now. Even the wind had quieted. But beneath the calm, there was something else. An echo, faint but unmistakable. Not the echo of fear, but of endurance, the kind that comes from surviving together. He left the barn door slightly ajar, letting the moonlight spill in. As he turned to go, Ruby shifted, lowering her head to drink from the trough. The small sound of water rippling against metal seemed to steady his pulse. Back in the house, Eli poured himself a finger of bourbon, the cheap kind he saved for nights like this. The amber liquid caught the light of the oil lamp as he sat by the window, watching the barn in the distance. He could see the faint outline of Ruby through the cracks in the boards, still, breathing, alive. He took a slow sip and let it burn down his throat. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere across the plains, long and mournful. The sound carried through the valley and died softly against the hills. Eli exhaled. "You and me, old girl," he said to no one. "Looks like the ghosts ain't done with us yet." As he leaned back, he noticed a flicker of movement near the fence line. A car. Headlights dimmed, engine idling. His jaw tightened. Mason Grant's men again, maybe checking boundaries, maybe filming the land in the dark. He stood and pulled on his jacket, stepping out onto the porch. The night air hit cold against his skin. The car's headlights blinked once before disappearing down the dirt road, leaving only the smell of exhaust. Eli stared after them until the darkness swallowed everything. Then he turned back toward the barn. Inside, Ruby gave a soft nicker, as if sensing his unrest. He smiled faintly. "Go on, sleep," he whispered. "We'll need our strength soon enough." The wind picked up again, brushing through the wheatgrass like the low hum of an old hymn. The moon climbed higher, and the barn glowed pale under its light. Somewhere deep inside, Eli felt it. The unspoken bond between them hardening, quiet but unbreakable. And as he closed the door behind him, the echoes in the stable faded into a silence that promised change. The next morning arrived pale and windless. Frost still clung to the edges of the wooden fence, sparkling faintly in the early light. Eli Turner was mending a broken hinge on the stable door when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The sound was too smooth, too clean to belong to a neighbor. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. A sleek black Cadillac pulled up near the barn. The chrome shone even under the dull sky, its reflection slicing across the muddy ground. From the driver's seat stepped Mason Grant, dressed in a light gray suit that seemed allergic to dirt. His boots were polished, his cologne sharp enough to cut through the smell of hay. A man who didn't belong to the land, yet claimed to own it with a pen. "Morning, Mr. Turner," Mason called, his voice smooth as oil. "I was hoping to have a word." Eli wiped his hands on his jeans and leaned against the fence. "You already had your men snooping around. What's left to say?" Mason smiled politely, the kind of smile that came from habit, not heart. "No hard feelings, I hope. Just due diligence. You know how it is with real estate investment. Property values, development rights, renewable permits." The words fell like coins onto wood, bright, empty, metallic. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, thick and heavy. "I came to make you an offer, a generous one, enough to let you retire comfortably." Eli didn't move. The wind rustled the prairie grass behind them, the only sound between them for a long stretch. "I'm not selling," Eli said finally. Mason's smile widened, but his eyes hardened just slightly. "You should at least look at the numbers. The Cold River Eco Park will bring jobs, tourism, clean energy, solar panels, equestrian resorts, eco-friendly hotels. Your land is key to the project. Everyone wins." "Everyone but the land," Eli replied quietly. Mason chuckled, shaking his head as if indulging a stubborn child. "You're too sentimental, Mr. Turner. Dirt is dirt. It only has value when it's put to work." Eli straightened, his voice steady. "This land is work. It's memory. You think money replaces that?" The smile faltered. Mason took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I respect what this place means to you, but nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. I'm offering you a way out before this place eats you alive. The taxes alone will drown you next year." He slid the folder across the fence. "Think about it. You could start over anywhere, Florida, Arizona, buy a small ranch, maybe a few good horses. This one," he nodded toward Ruby. "She looks like she's had her day." The words hit like a slap. Ruby, grazing nearby, lifted her head as if she understood the insult. Her ears twitched, her eyes catching the pale sunlight, dark and defiant. Eli's jaw tightened. "You don't know a damn thing about her." Mason sighed theatrically. "I know no business, Mr. Turner, and business says time runs out for everyone." Eli picked up the folder, turned it in his hands, and then set it back on the fence. "You said everyone wins. Tell me something. What happens when the water runs dry? When you've paved over the soil that feeds your so-called eco-resort?" Mason's expression cooled. "Progress doesn't stop for anyone." "Maybe not," Eli said, stepping closer, his voice quiet but cutting. "But neither does the earth. And it's got a longer memory than you." The two men stood in silence, the wind sliding between them like a blade. Then Mason adjusted his cufflinks, smiled again, and stepped back toward his car. "You've got until the end of the month. After that, I'll assume your answer's final." He paused, his hand on the door. "You know," he added, "my father was a rancher once. He died broke. The world changed while he was busy holding on to the past. Don't make the same mistake." The door shut with a metallic thud. The Cadillac rolled away, tires spitting mud as it climbed the hill. Eli watched it go until it disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did he let out a slow breath. He turned toward Ruby, who was still standing near the fence, watching him. The wind tugged gently at her mane. Her eyes were calm but questioning, as if she too had felt the sting of being dismissed. "Yeah," he muttered. "I heard him." He rubbed her neck, his rough hand moving over the warm muscle. "Maybe we're both out of time." Ruby pressed her head lightly against his shoulder. The small gesture undid something inside him, something he hadn't realized was still wound tight. Inside the barn, the world felt smaller, but safer. He poured feed into her trough and listened to the rhythm of her chewing. It was steady, grounding. He sat on the edge of a hay bale, letting the silence stretch. Through the cracks in the wall, sunlight fell in slanted lines across the dust. He thought about Mason's words. Progress doesn't stop for anyone. He had heard that same tone years ago from bank clerks, from men who wore the same kind of polished shoes, from anyone who measured worth in numbers instead of roots. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo. Lydia, standing beside Ruby, both of them caught in the glow of summer. The color had faded, but her smile hadn't. She'd believed the land was sacred, that you couldn't sell what you were part of. He tucked the photo back into his pocket and stood. "Guess it's up to us now, girl," he whispered. Outside, the prairie wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain and earth. The clouds gathered low on the horizon, heavy and gray, promising another storm. Ruby lifted her head and gave a soft snort, her ears twitching toward the sound of thunder in the distance. Eli leaned against the fence post, watching the storm crawl closer. "Let it come," he murmured. "We've stood through worse." The first drops began to fall, tapping against the barn roof like a slow heartbeat. The world smelled alive again. Wet soil, pine, electricity. Ruby shifted beside him, steady and unafraid. Eli smiled faintly. "Money can't buy this," he said, half to himself, half to her. "And I wouldn't sell it if it could." As the rain came harder, he stayed where he was, the two of them standing in quiet defiance against the coming dark. The offer of gold still lay unopened on the fence, the ink already bleeding under the rain. The rain lingered through the night and well into the following afternoon, turning the yard into a field of glistening mud. When the clouds finally tore apart, light flooded the valley, washing every surface with a clean, blinding sheen. Eli Turner stood by the paddock, boots sinking into the wet earth, watching Ruby step gingerly through the puddles. Her coat gleamed, chestnut darkened to mahogany by the rain. She looked almost new again, though the scar on her leg caught the sun like a thin white flame. Maggie Lee had returned early that morning. She carried a small notebook and a warmth that seemed to chase the cold from the air. "She's moving better," she said, leaning on the fence. "Still favoring that left leg, but there's strength there. She's remembering how to use it." Eli gave a grunt, half acknowledgement, half disbelief. "She remembers too much," he muttered. "The storm last night had her pacing for hours." Maggie smiled softly. "Maybe she just needed to know you were still here." He didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward Ruby. The mare had stopped grazing and was staring back at them, ears forward, expression alert. Something about the way she stood, steady, proud, almost defiant, made Eli's chest tighten. "Would you mind if I worked with her a bit?" Maggie asked. "Nothing rough. I want to try something different, something she can control." Eli hesitated, then nodded. "She bites when she's nervous." "I bite back," Maggie said with a small grin, and slipped into the paddock before he could protest. Ruby watched her carefully. The girl moved with deliberate calm, boots making soft sounds in the mud. She carried no whip, no halter, just a length of soft rope and patience. She circled slowly, not trying to get close, just letting Ruby feel her presence. The mare's ears flicked toward her, nostrils widening. Eli leaned on the fence, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He wanted to believe this girl knew what she was doing, but something inside him, years of failed trainers, lost money, broken promises, kept his guard up. Maggie stopped within a few feet of Ruby and waited. The air between them seemed to thicken. The only sound was wind sliding through the grass. Then Ruby took one step forward. Maggie didn't move. She simply let the horse come. The mare's breath puffed in slow clouds, her hooves squelched softly in the mud. When she was close enough that Maggie could feel the heat of her breath, the girl raised a hand, palm open. Ruby's head dipped slightly. testing, then pressed her muzzle into Maggie's palm. Eli's breath caught. "She's not afraid of touch," Maggie murmured, without turning. "She's afraid of what comes after." Ruby flicked an ear, as if listening. Maggie moved her hand gently along the mare's neck, fingers tracing the rise and fall of muscle beneath the wet coat. The horse's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Eli saw peace there, fragile, but real. Maggie's voice dropped lower. "You still carry the storm, don't you? But maybe that's what makes you strong." Something shifted in Ruby's posture. Her head lifted slightly, the sunlight catching her eyes. There was fire, there. Not wild or angry, but something burning quietly, steady as breath. Eli stepped closer to the fence. "She hasn't looked like that since—" He stopped himself before finishing. "Since Lydia. Since the last summer before the flood." Maggie glanced at him. "She's not just remembering, she's choosing to trust again." They worked until the sun began to set, the light spilling across the valley in shades of gold and rust. Maggie guided Ruby through small exercises, circling, stopping, backing a step. Each motion was gentle, deliberate. The mare hesitated at times, but she obeyed without fear. When they finished, Maggie slipped off her gloves, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. "She's remarkable," she said, smiling. "That fire in her, it's not gone, just buried." Eli looked at Ruby standing there, chest rising and falling. "That fire's cost her plenty," he said quietly. "Same as me." Maggie tilted her head. "Maybe that's why she hasn't given up." They fell silent, both watching the horse as she moved toward the fence, her reflection mirrored in a pool of rainwater. The air smelled of wet pine and distant smoke from someone burning brush down the valley. Eli finally spoke. "When Lydia was alive, she used to say Ruby had lightning in her blood. Never saw a creature run so hard toward the wind. After the accident, that lightning died. I guess I stopped looking for it." Maggie's voice softened. "Maybe you were just waiting for someone to remind you where to look." Her words hung there, tender and unassuming, like a truth that didn't need to be argued. Eli ran a hand over the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the sudden stillness inside him. "You sound like my wife used to," he said, half smiling. "Then she was a smart woman," Maggie replied. They stood there until the light faded completely. Ruby had lowered her head again, grazing quietly. Her shadow stretched long against the fence, moving gently with the wind. Eli finally spoke, his tone low, almost to himself. "I don't know what this is all leading to, but I can feel something changing." Maggie nodded. Change isn't always bad. As they walked back toward the barn, Eli glanced once more over his shoulder. Ruby lifted her head, eyes catching the last ember of sunset. For a moment, it looked as though fire really did live in her, an echo of what she'd been, and maybe what she was becoming again. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the room washed in moonlight. The offer Mason Grant had left sat unopened on the table, still stained from the rain. He reached for it, hesitated, then pushed it aside. Outside, Ruby shifted in her stall, the faint clink of her bridle echoing like a heartbeat in the dark. He whispered toward the barn, "We're not done yet, girl." And somewhere across the wide silence of the plains, a single star fell, leaving a brief, golden streak, like fire escaping from heaven, landing quietly in her eyes. The week that followed felt strangely lighter. The air over the valley had warmed, and for a few precious days, the land seemed to breathe again. Eli Turner woke early each morning, feeding Ruby and checking fences, his routine steady, almost hopeful. Maggie stopped by daily, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but a smile, and that quiet determination that made even the hardest hours feel less heavy. For the first time in years, laughter, thin, rusty, but real, echoed through the barn. Then, one afternoon, the wind began to change. The sky thickened with dark clouds rolling down from the north. Eli had been repairing the gutter by the stable roof when the first low rumble of thunder trembled through the ground. Ruby lifted her head, ears flicking nervously. The smell of rain came fast. Wet dust, pine sap, and something sharp, electric. "Storm's coming early," Maggie said, glancing up from the paddock where she'd been sketching Ruby's stance for her notes. "Yeah," Eli replied. He didn't look up. He could feel it, something mean and restless in the air. "You should head back before it gets bad." But by the time she packed her things, the sky had already turned the color of bruised steel. The wind whistled through the barn rafters, rattling the windows. Eli led Ruby inside just as the rain started, sudden and violent. Sheets of water hammered the roof. Lightning cracked across the horizon, and the thunder that followed made the ground shake. Ruby bolted sideways, eyes wild. "Easy, girl," Eli said, pulling on the rope. "It's just—" A second flash of lightning split the sky, brighter, closer. The thunder hit almost instantly. Ruby reared, hooves striking air, rope, jerking hard against Eli's hand. He stumbled, barely keeping his footing. "Ruby!" he shouted, voice swallowed by the roar outside. Maggie ran in, drenched, her hair plastered to her face. "Eli, let her go! She's panicking!" "She'll hurt herself," he shouted back, trying to steady her. His boots slipped in the mud forming under the leaking roof. Ruby's body twisted, eyes rolling white, muscles trembling like wires drawn too tight. The thunder crashed again, and she lunged backward, slamming against the stall. "Let her breathe," Maggie yelled. Eli held tighter. "She'll run through the wall if I do." Ruby's scream, half terror, half defiance, ripped through the storm. Eli felt the pull like fire up his arm. His breath came hard, his chest tight. Something deep in him cracked open. The old fear, the helplessness of that night years ago when the flood rose and he nearly lost her. The same sound, the same smell, the same weight of rain trying to bury them both. He snapped. "Stop it!" he shouted, jerking the rope. "It's over, damn it! It's over!" For a heartbeat, everything froze. Ruby's eyes locked on him, wide and glistening. She stopped fighting, but not from calm. She was terrified. The silence between them was worse than the thunder. Eli's hand trembled, the rope slackening slowly. Then Maggie's voice cut through the air, low but sharp. "You're not fighting her, Eli. You're fighting yourself." He turned toward her, soaked, breath ragged. "You don't understand. I understand more than you think." She stepped closer, water dripping from her jacket. "You can't make her forget by force. You're the one who won't let go." The words hit harder than the rain. Eli looked back at Ruby. The mare was still trembling, but she wasn't pulling anymore. Her eyes had softened. Not trust, not fear, just exhaustion. The storm outside kept raging, but inside the barn, everything felt still. Eli dropped the rope. The sound of it hitting the wet floor was small, almost delicate. He stumbled back, his legs weak. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to the horse, the girl, or the ghost of his wife that still haunted this place. Maggie moved to Ruby's side, her hands gentle, voice a soft murmur. "It's okay, girl. It's done now." The mare lowered her head, breath coming slower. Rain dripped through a hole in the roof, forming small ripples in the puddle near Eli's boots. He sank down onto a hay bale, water running down his face, though he wasn't sure if it was rain or tears. After a while, the thunder began to fade, rolling away toward the mountains. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone. Maggie sat down across from him, silent. Between them, Ruby's breathing steadied. Eli finally spoke. "I've spent my whole life trying to fix things that don't need fixing. Maybe she doesn't need to be cured. Maybe she just needs me to stop being afraid for her." Maggie nodded slowly. "Fear's not something you erase. It's something you walk beside until it stops leading the way." The quiet that followed was heavy, but no longer sharp. The rain softened, turning into a steady rhythm against the tin roof. Ruby shifted, her head dropping to nudge Eli's shoulder lightly. He lifted his hand and rested it on her neck. Her coat was damp and warm beneath his palm. "That's it, girl," he murmured. "We're still standing." Outside, the clouds began to break. A streak of light cut through the gray, falling over the field like a path home. For the first time in a long while, Eli didn't flinch from the sound of thunder echoing far away. He sat there until the last of the storm passed, hand still on Ruby's neck, his heart finally slowing to match her breathing. When he looked up, the sky was open again, washed clean, soft with light. Maggie stood by the door, watching them with quiet pride. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start again. But slower this time." Eli gave a tired nod. "Yeah," he said, "slower sounds just right." That night, after she left, he stayed in the barn. The ground was slick, the air thick with the scent of rain, and hay. He closed his eyes and listened, to Ruby's breathing, to the whisper of wind through the rafters. For the first time, the echoes didn't sound like ghosts. They sounded like forgiveness. The storm left behind a silence that seemed to hum. By morning, the air over Cold River was washed clean, the sky a polished blue stretching wide over the plains. The puddles that dotted the pasture caught the light like fragments of broken glass. Eli Turner walked through the wet grass, his boots squelching with every step, Ruby following close behind. Her coat shimmered in the early sun, damp but glowing. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of the sound of dripping water. It fell from the eaves of the barn, soft and steady, a rhythm that no longer made her flinch. Eli watched her drink from a trough overflowing from the storm, and the sight stirred something quiet in him. A strange, tender calm. Hank Wallace arrived not long after sunrise. He was a big man with a slow gait, his gray beard tangled like dry moss. He'd been shoeing horses longer than Eli had been alive, and though his hands looked rough as leather, his voice was low, almost musical. "Heard you wrestled a storm last night," he said, leaning against the gate, "and lost the argument." Eli managed a weak smile. "Seems like it." Hank nodded toward Ruby. "She's still here. That's what counts." He stepped closer to the mare, studying her leg with the calm precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading pain in silence. "She carries it well, you know. The kind that never leaves but stops hurting after a while." Maggie came out from the barn, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You sound like a philosopher, Hank." Old horses make philosophers of all of us, he said with a grin. But this one's got more spirit than I expected. They talked for a while about nothing. The weather, feed prices, Hank's creaky truck. But eventually the old man's tone shifted. You know, he said, turning to Eli, the Apache used to train their horses in rivers. Said the water teaches calm better than any man. When an animal feels the river move beneath it, it learns what it means to yield without giving up. Maggie's eyes lit up. That's beautiful. Hank shrugged. It works, too. You should try it. Take her to the shallows near the ridge. Let her feel the current. Eli hesitated, looking toward Ruby. The idea of bringing her near deep water again made his stomach twist. You think that'll fix her fear? Fear doesn't need fixing, Hank said, tapping his cane against the mud. It needs somewhere to rest. Later that afternoon, with the sun lowering and the light turning honey gold, Eli led Ruby toward the river. The trail was narrow, the grass still slick from rain. Maggie walked a few paces behind, quiet, letting the two of them move in their own rhythm. The air was warm, filled with the sound of distant crickets and the soft rush of water ahead. When they reached the bank, Ruby stopped. The river was swollen but gentle, the current glinting with sunlight. Eli could feel her tense, the faint tremor in her muscles, the way her ears flicked toward the water. He spoke softly. It's all right, girl. Not like before. We'll take it slow. He stepped into the shallows first. The cold bit at his ankles, seeping through his boots. He turned, holding the rope loose. Come on. For a moment, Ruby didn't move. Her eyes were wide, searching the water as though it might rise up again. Eli waited. He didn't pull, didn't coax. He just breathed. Slow, even breaths. And after a while, she took a step. The water rippled around her hoof. Another step followed, then another, until she stood beside him, both of them reflected in the shimmering surface. Maggie exhaled behind them. That's it, she whispered. Eli reached out and touched Ruby's neck. Her skin was cool under his hand, but her pulse was steady. You feel that? He said softly. It moves, but it doesn't take you. That's all life ever does. They stayed there for a long time, the river swirling around them. Ruby lowered her head and drank, the sound quiet and rhythmic. The world seemed to shrink to that single point. The water's murmur, the breeze carrying the scent of pine, the faint warmth of sunlight slipping over their shoulders. When they stepped back onto the bank, Ruby shook herself, sending droplets flying through the air like sparks. Eli laughed, a sound that surprised even him. Maggie smiled, brushing water from her face. Looks like she baptized you, she teased. Maybe we both needed it, he said, and for once the words didn't feel heavy. As they walked home, the light began to fade into shades of lavender and silver. The river whispered behind them, fading into distance. Ruby walked at Eli's side, her steps sure, her breathing calm. That night, the barn felt different. The air was warm, almost sweet. Eli brushed Ruby's coat until it gleamed, his movements unhurried. When he finished, he stayed beside her for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. There was no tension in her body now, no ghost hiding in her eyes. He whispered, "You did good, girl." Ruby turned her head slightly, her muzzle brushing against his arm in answer. Eli leaned on the stall door, staring out through the open window. Beyond the fields, the moon had risen, a pale coin above the dark ridge. The river shimmered faintly, catching the light as it curved through the valley. For the first time in years, Eli didn't see the water as an enemy. It wasn't something that took, it was something that carried. He realized then that maybe Hank was right. The river didn't teach you to fight your fear. It taught you to move with it. He smiled to himself, brushing his thumb along the scar on Ruby's leg. "We're getting there," he said quietly, "one step at a time." Outside, the night deepened, soft and endless. The wind rustled through the tall grass, whispering like distant waves. Ruby's eyes caught the lantern light, warm and alive. The lesson of the river had begun to take root, not in her body, but in both of their hearts. The first heat of summer crept quietly over the plains. Grass turned a little drier each day, the air shimmering with waves of light by noon. The river had retreated to its banks again, leaving the stones slick and shining under the sun. For a while, peace returned. Days of slow work, quiet mornings, and the rhythm of hooves on soft ground. But peace, Eli Turner knew, was never meant to last long out here. He was fixing the old windmill when he heard the rumble of an engine pulling into the yard. A flash of chrome caught his eye, followed by the heavy crunch of boots. Mason Grant was back, but this time he wasn't alone. Two younger men stepped out behind him, one holding a roll of glossy posters under his arm. Mason's smile was wide, practiced, and cold as river ice. "Morning, Eli," he called, as if they were old friends sharing coffee. "Thought I'd drop by with some good news. The town's about to get exciting." Eli wiped his hands on his jeans, wary. "If it's about that resort again." "Oh, it's bigger than that." Mason snapped his fingers, and the younger man unfurled a poster. A bold headline stretched across the top. "The Pride Ride, a celebration of strength, tradition, and progress." Below it, a picture of horses mid-gallop, riders raising their hats under a sky bursting with confetti. Mason grinned. "We're holding a competition, open to the whole county. 3 courses, sand, rock, and mud. The winner earns not just a trophy, but a seat at the negotiating table. Whoever proves their horse is the best gets a say in the new development plans." Eli's stomach tightened. "A stunt," he said flatly. "A celebration," Mason corrected smoothly. "Of our heritage, of our future. You care about both, don't you?" Eli folded his arms. "You mean whoever wins helps you justify building on land that doesn't want you?" Mason laughed lightly, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "You can think of it however you like. I think of it as democracy on horseback. Besides, the town loves a good show." He turned to leave, but not before adding, "You should enter. Folks remember stories, Eli. Imagine, one last ride for the stubborn farmer and his lame horse. Would make quite the headline." Eli's jaw clenched, but he didn't reply. He watched as the Cadillac drove off, the posters fluttering in the hot wind. One had fallen to the ground, face up in the dirt. The image gleamed bright against the brown earth, a promise of glory or humiliation. By evening, the whole town had heard. Maggie showed up at the barn with a folded flyer in her hand, her face flushed with disbelief. "He's really doing this," she said. "Contest just to show off his money." Eli hung up a saddle, keeping his voice calm. "He doesn't care about horses. He just wants to prove everything's for sale." "Then don't let him," Maggie shot back. "Enter. Make them see what real strength looks like." Eli turned, startled by the fire in her tone. "You don't understand what you're asking. That course, mud, rock, Ruby wouldn't make it halfway." "Then let's train her." Her certainty unsettled him. He saw in her the same stubborn light Lydia used to have, the belief that faith alone could fix what time had broken. "It's not that simple," he said softly. Maggie stepped closer. "I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm saying she deserves a chance to prove what they all refuse to see." "You both do." Eli stared at Ruby through the open stall door. The mare stood quietly in the fading light, her chestnut coat deepening toward bronze, her head turned slightly as if listening. She seemed older somehow, wiser, like the land itself had carved patience into her bones. He sighed. "You think I should drag her into some fool's spectacle? Risk her breaking again just to feed his pride?" "No," Maggie said, her voice softer now. "I think you should remind him that pride isn't the same as honor." The words hung in the air. Outside, the cicadas had begun their endless chant, the sound rising and falling like breath. Eli leaned against the stall door, watching the dust swirl in the dying sunlight. He thought of Mason's smile, of the crowd's laughter when they saw Ruby stumble, of the taste of humiliation that had followed him for years. But beneath all that, he thought of something else. The way Ruby had stood calm in the river, the strength of her heartbeat steady against his hand. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the flyer spread out before him, its paper rustling in the warm wind. Across the field, he could see the faint glimmer of the river winding through the dark, like a thread of silver stitching the earth together. He heard Maggie's voice in his head again. "You both deserve a chance." By dawn, his mind was made up. He walked out to the barn, lantern in hand. Ruby stirred as he entered, her eyes reflecting the soft glow. Eli reached out, running his fingers along the ridge of her neck. "You hear that, girl?" he murmured. "They think you're broken. They think I am too." Ruby lifted her head, nostrils flaring. "Well," Eli whispered, "let's give them something worth remembering." The lantern light flickered, catching on the framed photo still pinned to the wall. Lydia, smiling beside a younger Ruby, the wind in her hair. He touched the edge of the frame and nodded to himself. Outside, the first light of morning crept across the plains, turning the dew into a sea of fire. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, and the wind carried the faint echo of church bells from the town. The ride was 2 weeks away. The valley had no idea what was coming. Eli stepped out into the dawn and whispered to the air, "All right, girl, let's begin." The next days unfolded like a slow heartbeat, steady and relentless. The posters for the Pride Ride fluttered on every fence post from the town square to the diner door, bright against the fading wood and dust. They carried Mason Grant's name in bold gold letters, promising excitement, prizes, and the glory of progress. For Eli Turner, it wasn't progress. It was a challenge drawn in ink and arrogance, and he had accepted it. At dawn each morning, before the sun had fully breached the ridge, Eli led Ruby down to the open field by the river. The air there was cooler, thick with the smell of wild sage and water. Maggie met them daily, notebook in hand, hair tied up beneath her hat. They didn't speak much anymore. There was nothing left to explain. The first few days were hard. Ruby still froze at loud sounds, the crack of a truck door, the distant echo of a hammer. Eli learned not to push. Instead, he stood beside her, breathing slow, matching the rhythm of her fear with his calm. "Just breathe, girl," he'd whisper. "We're not fighting anymore." Maggie watched in silence, jotting notes, her eyes bright but steady. She'd read somewhere that horses mirrored human emotion more precisely than any creature on earth. If the trainer's heart raced, so did theirs. If the trainer found stillness, the animal followed. What she didn't write down was what she saw. That Eli was changing too. The tension that had once coiled in his shoulders had begun to loosen. The old grief that clung to him like dust was slowly falling away. On the 5th morning, the valley woke under a thin mist. The world looked washed out, as if someone had taken a paintbrush and blurred its edges. Eli guided Ruby to the far edge of the field, where the ground dipped into soft mud. It wasn't deep enough to trap her, but it was enough to remind them both what lay ahead. Ruby stopped, nostrils flaring. The smell of wet earth filled the air, sharp and heavy. Eli felt her tremble. "I know," he murmured, "but this time, the mud doesn't win." He stepped forward, boots sinking with a squelch. He didn't tug on the rope. He didn't coax. He simply stood there, breathing, letting the quiet stretch. The river beside them gurgled softly, a steady, living sound. After a moment, Ruby took a cautious step, then another, until she stood beside him. Her hooves sank, but she didn't panic. She just stood, trembling, but still. Maggie smiled behind them. "That's it. Let her feel the weight, not fear it." They stayed that way for a long while, the two figures and the horse standing half in water, half in mud, surrounded by silence so thick it felt holy. Later that day, Hank stopped by. He didn't say much either. He just leaned against the fence, watching. When Eli finally brought Ruby back up from the riverbank, Hank nodded. "You're learning her rhythm," he said. "Feels more like she's teaching me," Eli replied. "That's how it works," Hank said. "The good ones always do." They trained like that for nearly 2 weeks. No shouting, no commands, just repetition and patience. Some days were good. Others tested every ounce of Eli's resolve. There were mornings when Ruby refused to move, when her fear flared up again, raw and wild. But instead of breaking her, Eli waited. He'd stand quietly beside her until her breathing matched his. Then they'd start over. Each small victory built on the last. The day she crossed the creek without hesitation, Eli felt his throat tighten. Maggie caught the look in his eyes but said nothing. She just smiled and scribbled something in her notebook. Trust isn't taught. It's remembered. One afternoon, they were practicing near the old corral when thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. It wasn't a storm, just a dry echo bouncing off the mountains. Ruby flinched, muscles tensing, but Eli didn't reach for the rope. He just lifted a hand, palm open. "It's all right," he said. "We've been through worse, remember?" Ruby blinked, ears twitching. She exhaled, a slow, deep breath, and the tension melted from her frame. Maggie's eyes shimmered. "She's ready," she whispered. Eli shook his head slightly. "No, she's steady. That's better than ready." The nights were different now, too. The barn no longer echoed with restless hoofbeats. Ruby slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. Eli often stayed up late, sitting on a stool beside her stall, oiling the old saddle he'd used since his 20s. It wasn't much to look at. Cracked, faded. But it was the same saddle Lydia had ridden in, the one Ruby had carried her in before the flood. He'd trace the worn leather with his fingers and whisper, "She's coming back, Lyd. Maybe both of us are." Outside, the crickets sang their steady chorus. The world felt alive again, each sound sharper, clearer. Even the silence had weight now, something he could lean on instead of run from. As the days shortened and the contest drew near, Maggie noticed something subtle changing between man and horse. They no longer looked like two beings connected by rope and will, but like one silhouette moving in unison. Ruby anticipated Eli's steps before he took them, responding to his breath, not his commands. On the final evening before the event, Eli led Ruby to the crest of the ridge where they could see the town lights flickering in the valley below. The banners for the Pride Ride waved in the distance, the sound of celebration faint, but growing. He rested his hand on Ruby's neck. "You see all that?" he said softly. "That's what they call pride." Ruby flicked an ear. He smiled. "But I think we've got something stronger." The mare exhaled, warm breath ghosting against his hand the last light of sunset, broke over them, painting their shadows long across the grass. That night, as Eli closed the barn doors, he didn't feel the familiar ache of dread. For the first time since Lydia died, he felt ready, not to win, but to face whatever came. The silence they'd built together had become their language, their armor. Tomorrow, that silence would have to speak louder than applause. The morning of the Pride Ride broke bright and mercilessly clear, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to shimmer with expectation. The town of Cold River had never been so alive. Cars lined the dirt road leading to the open field, where Mason Grant's men had built a makeshift arena of fences and banners. The wind carried the smell of grilled meat, dust, and ambition. Loudspeakers crackled with country music, the rhythm pulsing through the heat. Eli Turner arrived just after sunrise, leading Ruby by the reins. He wore his cleanest flannel shirt, though its edges were frayed, and his hat sat low over his weathered face. Ruby's coat gleamed in the light, brushed until it shone like copper fire. She moved calmly, each step steady and deliberate, as if she already understood this day wasn't about trophies. It was about truth. Maggie and Hank met him near the entry gate. Maggie's hands were shaking slightly as she pinned his number to his sleeve. "Remember," she said, voice soft but firm, "you're not here to prove them wrong. You're here to show them what's real." Eli gave a faint nod, his gaze on Ruby. "If she's with me, that's all the proof I need." The crowd was bigger than he expected. Hundreds of people gathered in stands made of plywood and pride. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Mason Grant stood near the judges' table, immaculate as ever, his smile all teeth and confidence. His white stallion shimmered beside him, every hair perfectly groomed, the embodiment of wealth and control. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer boomed, "welcome to the first annual Pride Ride, a celebration of courage, progress, and the unbreakable bond between man and horse." Applause thundered through the stands. Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't need fanfare. He just wanted quiet. The competition began with the sand course, long stretches of deep soil meant to test stamina. Mason's riders went first, galloping through the circuit in perfect unison, their movements rehearsed and sharp. The crowd cheered, phones lifted high. Then came the rocky ascent, a trail of uneven stones climbing a short hill. Eli watched, silent, as Mason guided his stallion up and down the incline with the ease of a showman. When Eli's turn came, the crowd hushed, some out of curiosity, others out of pity. The announcer's tone shifted slightly, respectful but doubtful. Next up, Eli Turner and his mare, Ruby. He led her to the starting line. The heat was thick, pressing against his skin. He looked at Ruby, who stood still, head slightly bowed. "We don't rush," he whispered. "We just breathe." At the signal, he gave a soft click of his tongue. Ruby started forward, her stride slow but deliberate. The sand clung to her legs, pulling at every step. But she didn't falter. She wasn't fast, she wasn't showy. Yet there was something mesmerizing about her rhythm, the patience, the steadiness, the quiet refusal to quit. By the time they reached the rocks, a few people in the crowd had begun to clap softly. Eli guided her up the hill. The old mare placed each hoof carefully, muscles flexing, her breath even. Near the top, a loose stone slipped beneath her. The crowd gasped, but Ruby found her footing again and continued, her tail flicking in defiance. When they descended, the applause grew louder, not thunderous, but sincere. Then came the final challenge, the mud course. The announcer's voice dropped. "And now, the part that separates the strong from the stubborn." Eli felt his throat tighten. The stretch of mud ahead looked darker than he'd imagined. Thick, wet, endless. Mason's men had poured water over it for hours, ensuring it would swallow the unprepared. He glanced toward the judge's table. Mason was smiling, confident. He dismounted, walking beside Ruby to the edge. The air around them seemed to hold its breath. "You remember this, don't you?" Eli murmured. "It's not the same. We've learned. We don't fight the mud. We walk with it." He mounted again, feeling Ruby's muscles shift under him. The gate lifted. Silence fell. They stepped forward. The first sound was the soft suction of hooves sinking. The crowd leaned forward. Eli felt Ruby tense, her breath quickening. "Easy," he whispered, hand steady on the reins. "Just breathe." For a few seconds, she froze. The smell of mud and stagnant water filled the air, the same smell from years ago, from the night of the flood. Eli's chest ached. He could almost feel Lydia's hand on his shoulder, her voice calm in his ear. "Trust her." Then Ruby moved. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate, her muscles trembling but holding. The crowd was silent now, the kind of silence that hummed with awe. Her chestnut coat gleamed with sweat and sun, her eyes fixed ahead. Halfway through, she stumbled. Eli leaned forward, whispering, "You're not alone." Maggie's voice carried from the sidelines. "Breathe with her, Eli." He did. He inhaled, slow and deep, matching her rhythm. And then, as if guided by the air between them, Ruby steadied herself and continued. By the time they reached the far edge, the crowd was on its feet. Not cheering, yet, but watching. Reverent. The mare emerged from the mud covered in it, dripping and shining in the sun like something reborn. Eli dismounted, patting her neck, his throat too tight for words. Mason's stallion followed, strong and flawless, but something was missing in its precision. When Mason finished, the applause was loud but hollow. Then, when Eli walked Ruby past the stands, the silence broke into a wave of clapping, not for spectacle, but for soul. Maggie ran to meet them at the gate, her eyes bright with tears. "You did it," she whispered. She did it. Eli smiled faintly, brushing mud from Ruby's neck. "We didn't win yet." Maggie shook her head. "You already did." The judges gathered, voices low, papers shuffling. Mason waited near his horse, his smile faltering as he watched the crowd surrounding Eli. For the first time, the man of money and glass towers looked uncertain. The announcer returned to the microphone, voice cracking slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we saw today wasn't about speed or elegance. It was about heart, about trust." He turned to the judges. A pause. Then, "The winner of the first Pride Ride, by unanimous decision, Eli Turner and Ruby." The applause that followed wasn't wild. It was raw, honest, human. Eli lowered his head, tipping his hat. Ruby nickered softly beside him, her breath visible in the heat, her eyes steady and alive. Mason stepped forward, extending a hand. "You proved me wrong," he said quietly, something genuine flickering in his tone. "Guess some things can't be bought." Eli took his hand, his grip firm. "Guess not." As the sun sank over the valley, casting long shadows across the field, Eli led Ruby out of the arena. The world around them blurred into gold and dust. She walked beside him, proud, free of fear. For once, there were no ghosts between them, only the sound of hooves against solid ground and the echo of a promise finally kept. The cheers lingered long after the judges left their seats. By the time the crowd began to thin, the afternoon sun had started to sink behind the cottonwoods, turning the field into a shimmer of amber and dust. Eli Turner stood beside Ruby near the edge of the arena, still half disbelieving what had just happened. Around them, people were talking softly, almost reverently, like they'd witnessed something they didn't quite know how to name. Ruby's sides rose and fell slowly, her chestnut coat darkened with sweat and streaked with dried mud. She looked worn but unbowed, her eyes steady on the horizon. Maggie was wiping tears from her cheeks, laughing and crying all at once. "You realize," she said, voice breaking a little, "you just changed this whole town's idea of what winning means." Eli gave a small, quiet smile. "She did that. I just followed her lead." Hank appeared, leaning on his cane. "That mayor of yours just taught a whole crowd of folks about patience. Lord knows I didn't think anyone could do that in a place like this." He tipped his hat to Ruby, then to Eli. "You did good, son." The compliment warmed Eli more than the sunlight. For a long moment, the three of them simply stood there, surrounded by the fading echoes of applause. The loudspeakers had gone silent. The vendors were packing up their stalls, only the pussyman. Wind kept moving, carrying the smell of trampled grass and warm dust. Then a shadow fell across them. Mason Grant was walking toward the group, his immaculate suit streaked with dirt for the first time since Eli had met him. His white stallion trailed behind, restless, head tossing against the reins. Mason's face was unreadable, the smile gone. "Mr. Turner," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "May I have a word?" Eli nodded. They stepped away from the others, stopping near the fence line. The field around them glowed gold in the late light. For a while, neither man spoke. Mason broke the silence first. "You made me look like a fool out there." Eli shrugged slightly. "Wasn't my intention." Maybe not. Mason's gaze drifted to Ruby, who stood a few yards away, her mane catching the light. But I guess that's what truth does. It makes pride look small. He exhaled, long and heavy. You know, when I started this, I told myself I was building something that mattered. Jobs, growth, a future. But watching that horse walk through the mud today... He paused, shaking his head. I realized maybe I was just trying to bury what I used to be. Eli studied him quietly. What was that? A kid, Mason said, his voice almost a whisper. On a farm not much different from yours. My old man used to say, "Don't forget where the dirt under your boots came from." I did. I traded it for marble floors and glass walls. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Guess I finally saw what I lost. For the first time, Eli saw not the polished magnate, but the man beneath. The exhaustion around his eyes, the weight of too many years spent proving something to no one in particular. Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. These are the deeds to the floodplain lots. The land you've been fighting to keep. I don't want them. Eli frowned. You don't have to do that. I do, Mason said firmly. Some things aren't meant to be bought. You reminded me of that. He extended the envelope. Eli took it slowly, the paper warm from the other man's hand. What are you going to tell your investors? Mason smiled faintly. That the land refused to sell. He glanced toward the horizon. And maybe they'll finally understand what that means. A long silence settled between them. The wind moved through the tall grass, making it sound almost like the hush before a prayer. Finally, Mason tipped his hat. Take care of her, Turner. She's more than a horse. She's a mirror. With that, he turned and walked away, his stallion following obediently. Eli watched him go, until he was just another silhouette, swallowed by sunlight. Maggie and Hank approached quietly. What was that about? She asked. Eli handed her the envelope. She opened it, eyes widening as she read. He gave it back, all of it. Yeah, Eli said softly. Guess even pride has its limits. They stood there until the last of the spectators had drifted away. The arena was empty now, save for scraps of paper fluttering in the breeze and a few stray feathers from the decorative banners. The air smelled of dust and victory. Something bittersweet. Something earned. As they began the slow walk back to the barn, Ruby kept close to Eli's side. Every few steps, her shoulder brushed his hand, as if reminding him she was still there. At the trailer, Maggie paused and looked back toward the field. Do you think he meant it? About changing? Eli tightened Ruby's reins gently. Maybe. Or maybe the land will do it for him. It has a way of humbling all of us eventually. When they reached the barn, the last light of the day had turned the world copper. Eli led Ruby into her stall, brushing away the dried mud from her coat. Each stroke of the brush revealed more of the gleaming chestnut beneath, like uncovering embers beneath ash. Maggie leaned against the doorframe, smiling. You know, when I first came here, I thought I'd learn about horses. Turns out, I learned more about people. Eli chuckled softly. They're not so different most days. You treat them with fear, they'll run. You treat them with respect, they'll stay. Ruby shifted in her stall, turning her head toward them. The lantern light caught her eyes. They burned not with fire, but with a kind of peace that comes only after surviving a storm. Eli set down the brush, his voice low. She's not just a horse anymore. She's every fight I ever lost, and every reason I kept trying. Maggie nodded, her own eyes glistening. And you gave her back her voice. He looked at Ruby, smiling faintly. No, he said. She gave me mine. Outside, the crickets had begun their night song again. The sound filled the space between them, warm and steady. Eli walked to the doorway, resting his hand on the frame as he looked out across the fields. The lights of the town blinked in the distance, faint but familiar. Somewhere beyond them, Mason Grant was probably packing up his things, driving back toward the life he'd built on concrete. But maybe, just maybe, he'd leave a window open this time, to let the wind remind him of where he started. Inside the barn, Ruby gave a soft whinny. Eli turned, his voice gentle. Rest, girl. We've earned a little quiet. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the air, no ghosts waiting in the corners, only stillness, clean and whole. Outside, the wind swept through the grass like a long exhale, carrying away the last traces of pride that had weighed down the valley. And in its place, there was only peace. The days after the pride ride felt unreal, like waking from a long, fevered dream. The noise had faded, the banners had come down, and the crowds that once filled the arena were gone. Only the land remained, quiet and wide, holding the memory of everything that had happened. For the first time in years, Cold River Valley seemed to exhale. Eli Turner moved slowly through the morning light, his steps unhurried. The barn doors were open, letting in a soft wind that carried the smell of dew and hay. Ruby stood in her stall, peaceful, her chestnut coat brushed to a soft glow. She lifted her head when she saw him, the kind of greeting that needed no sound. Morning, girl, Eli said, his voice low. Looks like we survived it, huh? The mare blinked lazily, then nudged his shoulder as he reached for the feed. It was a simple ritual, one they'd done 1,000 times before. But now, every movement felt different, lighter, as if the world had finally stopped holding its breath. The news of Mason Grant's decision had traveled fast. Within a week, word spread that he had dissolved his development plans entirely. He'd donated the disputed acres to the county for preservation, and he'd even pledged funds to restore the floodplains along the river. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was good publicity. Eli didn't much care. The land was safe again, and that was enough. Maggie arrived just as the sun began to crest over the ridge. She carried her camera this time, the strap looped around her neck, her boots muddy from the trail. I wanted to get some photos for my report, she said, but mostly I just wanted to see her again. Ruby flicked an ear toward her, recognizing the voice. Maggie smiled, raising her camera, but lowering it again before taking a shot. She looks at peace, she said softly. Eli nodded. So does the land. They stood together at the edge of the field, the wind pushing through the grass in long, slow waves. Down by the river, Hank was repairing a section of fence, whistling tunelessly as he worked. The sound carried faintly, blending with the hum of insects and the whisper of water. Maggie lifted her camera again, snapping a few pictures. The click of the shutter was soft, almost reverent. You know, she said, I think this is what healing looks like. Not the noise of winning, but the quiet after. Eli smiled faintly. Never figured I'd be a part of something worth photographing. Maybe that's the point, she said. The world needs to remember that not everything worth saving shines at first glance. They spent the morning tending to the horses, fixing tools, and talking about nothing in particular. Every so often, Ruby would lift her head toward the open door, ears twitching toward the sound of the river. She wasn't afraid anymore. The water no longer carried ghosts. It carried reflection. By midday, the air turned warm. Maggie packed up her things, promising to send her final report to the state university. "They'll love this story," she said. "A horse, a farmer, and a river that refused to forget." Eli chuckled. "Sounds like something they'd make a movie out of." "Wouldn't be the worst thing," she replied, with a grin. After she left, the ranch fell back into its quiet rhythm. The sun sank lower, painting the valley in gold. Eli led Ruby down to the river one last time before evening. The water shimmered, gentle and clear. They stood at the edge, where light danced over the surface like molten glass. He let the rope hang loose, trusting her. Ruby stepped into the water without hesitation, the ripples spreading out in slow, widening circles. Eli followed, boots sinking into the soft sand. Together they stood, the river flowing around them, cool and steady. "You did good, girl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You reminded me that silence isn't emptiness. It's where everything starts again." Ruby's ears flicked, and she breathed out a slow, warm sigh. For a long time, they simply stood there, two survivors sharing a quiet too deep for words. When they walked back to the barn, the sun had slipped behind the hills. The sky glowed in deep shades of violet and rose. Fireflies had begun to rise from the grass, their faint light blinking like tiny, wandering stars. Eli leaned on the fence, watching them drift. Ruby stood beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. From the distance came the faint sound of a truck engine. Mason's voice echoed faintly as he spoke to Hank, thanking him for directions before heading back toward the main road. As the sound faded, Eli felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not pride, but peace. That night, he wrote a single line in his old notebook before turning in. The paper was worn, the pen scratching faintly under his rough fingers. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't won by fighting, but by standing still long enough to listen. He left the notebook open on the table. Outside, Ruby shifted in her stall, her breathing slow and even. The barn smelled of hay, rain, and life. Before turning out the lantern, Eli looked around one last time. The photo of Lydia still hung on the wall, her smile captured in a moment that never aged. He touched the edge of the frame gently. "We did it, Lyd," he whispered. "She's free. So am I." The flame in the lantern flickered once, then went out, leaving the barn bathed in moonlight. Through the open window, the sound of the river drifted in. Soft, unending, full of life. Eli lay down that night with the window open, the air cool against his skin. He listened to the world breathing, the water, the wind, the steady rhythm of a horse sleeping nearby. And somewhere between waking and dream, he realized that for the first time in a long, long while, there was nothing left to fix. There was only the stillness after the storm. And now I want to ask you, do you believe that heart can still conquer pride? If your answer is yes, comment 1. If you think money always wins, comment 0. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because in the next story, another heart will rise from the dust and you won't want to miss it.